Revelation 17. We're starting to come to the close of this great book as we have looked at these successive series of judgments, seeing through it all Christ seated on the throne, executing his sovereignty over heaven and earth and bringing about these works. And now we begin to come towards the closing chapters of the book, which are building up to the return of Christ. What other books, I believe Titus calls the blessed hope, the glorious appearing of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, when the invisible becomes visible, or heaven breaks into earth, and you have the full and final manifestation of Christ's rule and reign. What we're going to do is we're going to come to chapter 17 tonight, and we'll read it as we go through it. We'll take it section by section and read the relevant verses as we come to each section. Let me introduce the text by showing how it connects to the previous chapter, what we looked at in our time together last Sunday evening, where we picked up the end of chapter 15 and then all of chapter 16. And what that gave to us was the 7 bowl judgments, the final succession of 7 judgments that Revelation gives to us, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets. We are told that there are 7 thunders in one chapter, but John is told not to write them down. And then we come to the 7 bowls or vials, judgments of God being poured out on the earth during, again, the time between the first and second comings of Christ. What God is doing during that period to already bring judgment on unbelievers. Just like we talk about salvation being something we already have, something we already enjoy. And yet it is something that we will fully and finally enjoy when Christ comes again. We've already been saved, and yet Peter talks about us receiving the salvation of our souls when Christ comes again. There's an already aspect and a not yet, something still to be enjoyed fully and finally. It is the same way with judgment. We sometimes think of Judgment Day as that final day, the great white throne. We talked about it this morning during the morning message, and that is true, the day when God judges the living and the dead. But as Revelation has shown us, there is a very real sense in which that judgment has already begun. And the idea, as we pray, is that it might open the eyes of the unbelievers. Sadly, though, Revelation speaks that the usual effect is only to harden them in their sin and in their rebellion. So we thank God for grace. So we come tonight to Revelation 17. And here's what we are going to see. One of the angels who has one of the 7 bowls, one of those angels pouring out the 7 bowl judgments, is going to come to John, and he's going to give him a more amplified description of bowls 6 and 7. That's been a frequent event in Revelation. You'll get the 7 judgments listed, boom, boom, boom. And then in the chapters that follow, you get kind of a closer look at some of the seals or some of the trumpets, and usually zeroing in on special details, building up again to final judgment. Well, chapters 17, 18, and 19 are going to do that. They're going to give us a closer look at the 6th and the 7th bowls, which again recount 2 things: the fall of Babylon and the final judgment, the second coming and the final judgment. And what we will read when we come to the end of chapter 19 in a few weeks is just that, the visible return of Jesus Christ. So let's come and look at chapter 17 tonight, which introduces us to the fall of Babylon. That's going to concern us for 2 chapters, but tonight we'll just look at chapter 17. Let me just one more time to remind you of the background, the significance of what John is telling us in chapter 17. It is often in the history of mankind that you will have alliances between economic factors, state or political factors, and even religious factors, that they will come together in a way that pressure is put on God's people to compromise their faith. persecution takes place against the people of God. That's not always the case. Not every nation and not every time period sees that happening in the same degree. That there's waves at times of persecution, or it can be heavier in some areas than in others. But especially all the way back in chapter 13, we were introduced to this idea with the two beasts, that often political factors and economic factors and even religious factors will ally themselves in persecution against God's people, the church of Jesus Christ. It was very prevalent in the first century, especially people living in the Roman Empire. Again, some areas worse than others. Different times it was more intense and there might be lulls, but it was a reality to those Christians living in first century Rome. Rome had a mighty political machine. Rome had a mighty military machine. Of course, there were economic unions, trade guilds, what have you, throughout the Roman Empire. And there was a Roman religion, pantheon of gods, and Caesar himself over time. I think it began with Augustus Caesar. It began to view the deceased Caesars as new members of the pantheon. And over time, the present Caesar would view himself as already divine, and therefore viewing himself as worthy of worship. And again, you didn't have to jettison Jesus from your worship, but you couldn't ignore the Caesar either. He had to be a part of your worship. So all those factors would come together and put pressure on God's people to compromise their faith and not worship Christ exclusively. More recently in human history, of course, we're familiar with the horrors of World War II in Nazi Germany. Probably read or at least aware of the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, somewhat evangelical Christian, questionable beliefs in a few areas, but in other things, very devoted to the idea that Christians should cry out against injustice, and when the state abused its powers and became an evil power, that the state should be resisted. And Bonhoeffer viewed what Hitler was doing as evil, as going against the scriptures. Well, Hitler had a church on his side. There was an aspect of the national church in Germany that did not stand up to what Hitler was doing. It was even complicit in it. And Bonhoeffer resisted that. It was part of a resistance movement. He paid for it with his life, being imprisoned and executed eventually in a criminal camp. Think of what we've seen at times from anti-religious communist regimes. Against Christianity, certainly against any kind of religious influence, viewing that as something that would keep the people in submission. They never rebel against the evil state if religion was keeping them deluded and dull. Anti-religious communist regimes. And even sadly, at times, Christians themselves have fallen prey to compromise with political power. Too much political power, too much political ambition, and believers have betrayed their religious ideals, betrayed their commitment to justice or what have you. These are realities that God's people face. The temptation to compromise or pressure from the outside. And John has written this book to encourage us, persevere amid such persecution. Do not compromise within the church with your doctrine or your lifestyle, and do not bow to the pressure from outside of the church. If you do that, you might suffer for it. But John tries to give us a long-range vision that ultimately Jesus will prevail. And furthermore, all unjust systems, all systems that hurt the people of God will fall. And chapter 17 comes in to say, let me show you another picture, God is saying, of just how severely that fall will be. So chapter 17 begins that focus. We have Babylon, that idolatrous power of economy, religious in some of its commitments, allied with the state, coming against the people of God. John says, let me show you. God says to John, let me show you their judgment. So first section is the introduction. This is where the angel sets up the vision that is to come. Let's read the first 3 verses. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute, who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. We'll stop there in the middle of the verse. First, notice how the angel describes this great city. Describes it there as a great prostitute. Doesn't name it as Babylon until we get to verse 5. And you can notice there in that description, we have Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. Babylon described this way here. Why? Because she's alluring, she's seductive. There's an influence there that would tempt the people of God. And even more than that, that would tempt the nations of the world. Now, the description of judgment that's going to come is patterned very much on the Old Testament. Jeremiah 51:13. The prophet says to ancient Babylon, "You who live by many waters and are rich in treasures, your end is come, the time for you to be destroyed." What we've got going on here is something we've seen frequently, a reference to an Old Testament story, a story that really took place. There was a real Babylon involved, the literal city that came under the judgment of God for oppressing and imprisoning the people of God. As we move forward in the history of God's people, those stories in many ways become symbols. And other nations are viewed as being Babylon-like in the way they treat the people of God. And thus, even the very title Babylon is applied to any system that might fit that description. Any city or influential power that might persecute the people of God. That is how the word is used here in the book of Revelation. I remember hearing sermons when I was younger. I believe during the 90s, Desert Storm, concerned that Saddam Hussein was interested in trying to rebuild the ruins of ancient Babylon there in modern-day Iraq. And the idea being there that we must be getting close to what Revelation is describing because Babylon might come back. It doesn't have to be the literal historical city. It's any force of power that would come against God's people and tempt them to compromise their faith. There are going to be many Babylons throughout church history as this book comes to the people of God that they can identify with. Why is Babylon judged? Again, skip ahead to verse 6. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. Here is this powerful city that sheds the blood of God's people. We read that she sits in verse 1 on many waters. And again there, the idea of a powerful influence, a commercial strength given to Babylon that is used against God's people. Verse 2, we read that the kings of the earth commit adultery with her. What is the idea here? Well, again, Babylon makes certain idolatrous demands. Babylon asks for certain religious commitments in exchange for earthly security. We'll see that in verse 4 as we read on. In order to receive the economic strength and approval of this power, there is this call for loyalty, for idolatry. Maybe not overt. They rarely use those exact words, but that's the nature of the call, some kind of compromise with Babylon in exchange for earthly security. And the kings of the earth, they can't resist it. It's just that material call is too strong to resist, the allure and love of money and to live for this world as if that was all there is to us as human beings. We read there that the kings of the earth commit adultery and they become drunk. They're intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. What's the idea there? They become numb to the nature of what they're doing. They begin to lose their desire to resist. They become blind to the fact, again, that Babylon herself has her own economic insecurities, that God is the only source of real security. And of course, then the idea that there might be a judgment day escapes their thoughts as they give in to this powerful force. What we read in verse 3, John is called away by the Spirit into the wilderness. And again, that's just language taken from the Old Testament. When a spirit comes to a prophet, it's going to commission the prophet to speak. Being brought out in the wilderness. The idea isn't so much that you need to be in the solitary place to hear the voice of God. No, back in Isaiah 21, God pronounces judgment on Babylon. And the prophet says, I hear this voice coming from the desert, speaking the word of judgment. It's language intended to make us think about those Old Testament promises of judgment now coming to pass in our time against the enemies of God. Let's come into the second section, the rest of verse 3 and through to verse 6. This is where John sees this economic, religious, political alliance. He sees this woman and he sees this beast, the woman, Babylon, and the beast. So let's just read the vision of what he sees here, starting in the middle of verse 3. Then I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. What does John see here? Again, a woman sitting on the beast. That's Babylon. We've said a few things about her. And then how is the beast described? With the very same words that the beast was described back in chapter 13. This beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. Again, words in Scripture that usually denote fullness. 7 heads and 10 horns is this fullness of power. This is an influential, powerful beast that the woman is riding. We read that the beast is scarlet. The woman sitting, yes, the beast is scarlet, red. What else have we seen in the book of Revelation that is red? The red dragon from chapter 12, who also has 7 heads and 10 horns. The dragon is Satan. So that is the ultimate force that energizes the beast. Furthermore, red would make us think of blood because of the shedding of blood that this beast does. The woman rides the beast. Why? Because we have an alliance here of political, economic, and religious power, all working together in concert to oppose the people of God. Why do we keep saying it's an economic power? Because of verse 4. The woman's dressed in purple, scarlet, glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She has a golden cup in her hand. She's wealthy. She's rich. She's dressed like royalty, the power of money and the influence of wealth. She is intoxicating, as we already noted in verse 2. But in verse 5, the names on her forehead, though she may be impressive in the sight, the names on the forehead tell her true nature. Remember, often in Revelation, we've already seen saints sealed in their foreheads, some taking the mark of the beast in their foreheads. Why? That's where we're told the real nature of different people. And what is the real nature on this woman's forehead? Again, Babylon the Great. You may remember from the book of Daniel. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar was driven mad because of his pride? Babylon the Great is the name he gave to his city right before God struck him with this madness. So this reflects the pride of the city. We're told here that the name on her forehead is a mystery. And mystery is a word in Scripture that often has reference to the end times. It's when God tells us how he's going to bring about his plans. This is what God is going to do. How is God going to bring about his judgment? That's what he's showing us here in this chapter. And again, mother of prostitutes and abominations. That's this influence, this powerful force over systems of idolatry. And at this point, pause and just think back to female characters we've already seen in Revelation. We have the woman who brought forth Christ in chapter 12. We're going to have the Lamb's bride coming down in chapters 19 and 20. These pictures of the people of God contrasted here with this destructive and wicked force. Finally, verse 6, as we've already read, those who don't submit to the requirements, those who will not betray their faith for the sake of economic security are persecuted by the alliance. And when John sees this, what do we read in the last part of verse 6? He's astonished. I think on one level, he's shocked at the blasphemy. He's terrified by the persecution. Maybe he's even a little awestruck with this glittering, dazzling image. How will God respond to that? Well, let's come into the third and final section. Verses 7 to 18, where the vision is interpreted for us. First the beast, and then the woman. But before the interpretation itself, John is somewhat rebuked. First, let's read verse 7. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. John is gently rebuked for being astonished. So whether it's intimidation, he's afraid, God is telling him, do not fear her. Why? God will judge her. Be faithful even unto death, as God has told his people throughout Revelation. And at the same time, if there is any astonishment and enamorment, God is saying, do not be enamored. She will corrupt you. Do not compromise with the world system if it means betraying your faith. And the angel therefore says, I'll tell you the true nature of this woman and the beast. Let's look at those two. First, the interpretation of the beast. Let's look at verses 8 and 9. The angel says, the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. First, this initial description. Notice that threefold title. The one who once was, now is not, and yet is to come. Does that remind you of the way God has been described in this book? How is God described? The one who was, the one who is, and the one who is to come. Now, something Revelation likes to do is take titles of God and descriptions of God and mockingly apply them to these substitutes to show that, look, they may try to sell themselves as the real thing, but they're not the real deal. There's only one God who once was and is to come. This beast that you see here, it once was, now it is not, and yet it will come. Well, what is the significance of that description? Keep in mind what we saw back in chapter 12, the decisive defeat of Satan by Christ at the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, he dealt Satan a decisive blow. He has no more grounds by which to accuse the people of God. As we'll see when we come to chapter 20, he is bound in a certain extent where he can no longer deceive the nation. So while he once had a certain power and authority, that was crushed, defeated at the cross. He is not yet fully consigned to eternal hell. Thus the idea that he still has some kind of persecuting assault against the people of God is what goes on now between the first and second coming. So that's the idea. He once was. Now he's not. He's severely limited now. And yet he will come, opening the door that at the very end of time, there will be a little flare-up, a little intensification of the persecution that Satan would bring against the people of God. But John's point there is not to scare John, but just to say this. You know what the only thing really is left for the beast to do? To go into destruction. To go to the final judgment that God has decreed for him. He says that there in verse 8. He once was, he now is not, and yet he will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. Don't fear what he can still do. The only thing left for the beast is judgment. Now, despite this fact, though, this is what God's people see. We see the reality. Sadly, those who do not know Christ do not see the same reality. And according to verse 8, the inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast. Those who do not have eyes to see will be amazed. And what is the ultimate difference maker? It is nothing but God's grace. It is not that we were clever enough to see. There were those whom God predestined unto life. There were those whose names were not written in the Lamb's book of life before he made the world. And for those, the beast is powerful. He's alluring. He's attractive. For those whom God has shown mercy to seal us and to open our eyes, we are able to see the true reality. Let's look more at this description in verses 9, 10, and 11. Again, verse 9, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads or 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, one is, the other is not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. What do we make of these details here. I know it's been several months, but if you think way back to when we introduced this series, we were talking about ways different folks interpret Revelation, and we talked about two camps that are kind of at the opposite extreme. One sees the events of this book as almost exclusively fulfilled in the first century. In other words, everything in Revelation was fulfilled then. The only thing left is for Jesus to come. There's another group that sees none of these events being fulfilled, at least from chapter 4 onwards, until the end of time, and what is frequently called the 7-year tribulation. We've taken a more mediating position, I guess, in that what we see here corresponds to the first century, but also reoccurs throughout history until Jesus comes again. When we come to these verses, usually there's a lot of attempt made to say, okay, what Roman emperors match this description? Where in Rome's history do we see 5 kings coming, 1 not, 1 yet to come, an 8th, etc.? The problem with that is it's hard to make it match perfectly Rome's history in any way. There's a whole list of different ways of doing it. If we were to postpone the book to the end, we would just have to say, okay, with whatever government there is in the end times, there's going to be this kind of disruption. Again, I'm going to take these numbers somewhat figuratively. We've got 7 heads and hills. What does that make you think of? That does make you think of the first century city, Rome. But the purpose of that is to give us this picture of government. And the number 7 is, again, that number of fullness, the oppressive power of world government throughout the ages, which at times can take to itself divine prerogatives and thus persecute God's people. I think when we come to these kings here, the 5 who have fallen, the 1 who is, and the 1 who is yet to come and will go up to destruction, just map that onto the description we were just given of the beast. He once was, he now is not, and yet he will come up to destruction. Again, it's God's way of saying this usurping power is a parody of God. It has been defeated, and the only thing that is left is for it to go to destruction. God's giving us these details not to say, okay, how exactly is this going to fit onto particular people, but to encourage God's people that ultimately that enemy has been defeated. The only thing left is maybe a little flare up at the end, this 8th beast that is the fullest and final manifestation of authority. But other than that, the only thing that is yet to come for the beast is destruction. So do not be afraid of it. Same kind of thing in verses 12 to 14. Let's read those and then come to the woman. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one and the same purpose. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Again, 10, the number of fullness. There is throughout history confederations of powers, confederations of sovereignties that enhance the power of the beast. Earthly kingdoms giving their allegiance to the state. And through these powers, the spiritual forces of Satan and the beast work. What is their goal? To persecute the people of God, to lead people to compromise their faith. But what is the encouraging idea? Their power is short and limited. Their power is but 1 hour. Which again, if you go back to that Daniel story of Nebuchadnezzar being driven mad, we read there that he was driven mad in 1 hour. That's how long it took for God to ruin mighty Nebuchadnezzar. And that's not a long time. So no matter what powers unite against the people of God, they will fall. And Jesus Christ will conquer. And with him will be his victorious, called, chosen, faithful followers. So that's the interpretation of the beast. Again, any kind of political power that would seek to oppose the people of God and lead them to deny their faith in Christ. Lastly, how do we interpret the woman? Verses 15 to 18. Then the angel said to me, the waters you saw, where the prostitute sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked, and they will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. One last time, we're given this description of Babylon. And again, she's described in a powerful way. She sits on many waters. Again, the ancient city of Euphrates, the ancient city of Babylon sat on the river Euphrates. And then these channels and canals became the means of their economic prosperity. To be able to have that maritime commerce, to have security against outside attacks. Babylon enjoys that same kind of security and prosperity. But eventually, she comes to ruin. Why? Well, we read that the political side of the alliance, the beast, actually turns against Babylon. There's some kind of disunity between these political factors and the economic and religious factors, and thus they turn on one another to destroy one another. The many followers of Babylon's religious, economic influence throughout the world ultimately become disloyal to her, and the state consumes the economic powers. Why does all of this happen? Why is there all this disunity and rupture? And what is going on? This is how God fulfills his sovereign plan. Verse 17, God has put it into their hearts. God directs this sovereignly, powerfully, in order to accomplish his purpose of judgment against those who would hurt his people. Again, the idea we saw earlier, those whose names were not written in the Lamb's Book of Life from before the foundation of the world. And again, we don't read this in a vindictive manner, in a way of saying, yes, those evil people out there will get that. It's written to humble us. We only escape judgment by sovereign grace, and also to encourage us persevere in the faith, no matter what discouragement comes from outside. And that's the conclusion we bring the whole chapter to. Again, what a contrast. Babylon and its wickedness with the people of God, God's pure and spotless bride. Gratitude for God's grace and salvation, and assurance that persevering in the faith is worth it. In whatever way these forces might show up in your life, and in your daily interaction, see through it. Don't compromise your faith to gain any kind of economic, political, social advantage. They may not come into conflict, but if they do, we maintain our loyalty to Jesus Christ. He will take care of his people. He will bring the ungodly forces to ruin. Let's give thanks. Father in heaven, how thankful we are